hope you had a good time at the breakout sessions, learned some stuff, met some new people, connected a little bit. So I'm super excited to have this fireside chat with Eddie. So again, thanks for hosting us in this beautiful venue. And we were chatting earlier, and we would like to kind of get a sense of who's in the room. And one of the first questions we'd like to know is can people raise their hand? Is there in a company that's 1 to 10, small companies? All right. 11 to 50, 50 to 100, and over. Okay, bigger companies. Cool. And ICs versus managers. So people that are individual contributors can raise their hands. Right, and managers, mostly managers. Cool.
Cool, thanks. That helps. I'll try to kind of custom tailor the answers based on the audience.
So, Eddie, why don't you start and quickly introduce yourself, CTO of Gusto.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you everyone for coming. Thanks Plato for hosting this amazing event. I saw everyone really engaged in their breakout session, so that's always really exciting to see. A few people have asked me about the office here today. We've been here for about 4 months now, and it's kind of a unique office, as you might have guessed. The history of it is it's actually used to be a shipbuilding yard. I believe they used it to build warships during World War II. And so, but when we moved in, it was basically just this kind of brick facade, super historical building, obviously. And you can kind of see what they did with it. They actually put this steel structure around it. And everything you see around you is kind of supported by this steel structure, which is really kind of, if you think about it, it's just a building within a building. So all these things that are hanging over you, it's all just from the steel structure inside the actual brick. The brick is actually not doing anything. So a few people asked me about it, so I thought it was kind of interesting to share.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, it was very cool venue. So let's start off and talk about scaling the engineering culture. And the first thing is as a CTO, because sometimes a lot of people think culture comes from the top, and top, we usually think about the CEO very much. But how do you feel about your role into the company culture and also the engineering culture?
Yeah, so as kind of the head of engineering, I would say one of my primary roles, if not the most important role that I have, is to actually help build and evolve the culture in the company and in the engineering team. Values are kind of really high level, almost like principles, things that are really important to you. And they're so high level that actually oftentimes you can describe it. You can describe your 4 to 6 values that are important to your company or your engineering team. And then culture is kind of the implementation of those values. And that's actually really hard to describe because culture is, it's everywhere around you at a company, right? It's how you communicate, it's the activities that you praise or the activities you discourage, it's the meetings that you have. As a company is growing, a team that's scaling really quickly, that culture has to change. I think it's really normal for the culture to change. Whereas the values, you want those to more or less stay static because they very much describe innately who you are. My role as head of engineering is to make sure those values are kind of really static at the company and that you're being true to those. But then as a company evolves, as it grows, that the culture is changing, but still in a way that's really congruent with your values.
And the topic is on engineering culture, and sometimes we've been talking for the same thing around company culture, engineering culture. How do those two differ in your opinion, and should they, or is it fine, or how do you see those two things living together or kind of splitting apart?
Oftentimes in tech companies, you start by hiring engineers, and 90% of your team is just engineers. Usually everyone but the CEO is actually very technical. So when you're starting a company, I think the company culture is the engineering culture, or the engineering culture is about 90% of your company culture. So in that case, it's very much the same. But as teams grow, and based on the audience poll, a lot of us are actually in companies with more than 100 employees. you might be in a situation where the engineering team is actually not the largest team in your company, or is less than 50% of your company. And in that case, I think you start to see engineering culture diverge a little bit from company culture, but not in a bad way. I think they have to be all, again, based on the same set of values that are really important to the company. And it's actually okay to allow different teams to have slightly different cultures. And even within our engineering team, as Nick was saying, we have a team here in San Francisco, we have a team out in Denver. And I think the cultures within the engineering team are also a little bit different as well. And like an example of that is, there's even culture around like when people get into work and when people leave. And Denver tends to, the Denver engineers tend to come in a little bit earlier than San Francisco engineers. Us here, we like to come in at like 10 o'clock or so, and stay a little bit later, of course. But Denver engineers, their culture is a little bit more, let's start early, let's go home when there's still daylight, and go hiking or skiing afterwards. And that's totally okay too, right? It would be actually unhealthy to kind of impose the same culture across both offices.
I see. You mentioned a lot like companies growing, because Gusto, 700 engineering team, about like 100 plus, and you make me think. So at Plato right now we're around 20, and of course it's even like a few months before we started to think about culture, and it's not so easy. And I remember having conversations with people around like how to start thinking about culture, and I remember like I don't know if it was an advice, but like a really interesting thought around. One way of starting to think about culture is think about rituals, and it's exactly what we're doing. And it's not about putting big words on the walls, because it's really hard when you're like 10 or 5 or 20. But like rituals are easy to kind of start to think about and easy to update as well, to adapt. So how did the culture was being built at Gusto from when you were 500 and now like 700?
Yeah, so I think we started in exactly the same way. Like when you're just starting a company, you're not really thinking about culture. Culture is kind of, it doesn't mean culture doesn't exist. Like it happens very implicitly. And so a good example of that for us is, as you might tell, we are a shoeless office here at Gusto. So you probably all have your shoes off and your socks on. And that was just kind of very organic. We didn't say our culture is no shoes when we were at home, and we started the company at home. So that's kind of like just happened very organically. And so culture kind of when you're starting a company is built very implicitly. I think as you get around maybe, 10 to 15 people in the company, I think it's probably a good time to start being a little bit more explicit about first your values and then the culture that you build on top of those values. And that's exactly what we did here at Gusto. We did our 6 company values. And then also we had a similar process for our engineering team. And when the engineering team got to around, I think, like 15 engineers or so, and we just talked about, hey, everyone, like what are the 6 values for our engineering team that are really important to us? What's important to you? And so I think there is a point where it goes from implicit to explicit. And it feels to me, at least in Gusto's story, around like 15 or so is when you kind of, when a team gets around 15, you start having more of that explicit discussion.
So can you tell us what are the traits of the engineering culture, and then what are they?
Yeah, so some of our values, I won't name them all, but one that's like I think really important to me, and also, by the way, values aren't always all equal. I think you'll find at companies there's ones that you talk about a lot more than others. For me, the one that's really important and that I'm really proud of in our engineering team is this idea of service mindset. And it's the idea that we're here as engineers to build something, to be in service to others. We want to help others with this seemingly magical power that we have. And a lot of times it's to help our customers, but a lot of times we want to help our teammates internally. Don't be the priestly class. And that's unfortunately something I think I've observed a lot in like kind of other tech companies where engineering teams kind of get put on a pedestal. They get treated a little bit differently from the different functions in the company. And I have not a roommate anymore, but my best friend works at Google. He's not an engineer, but he works in the San Francisco office. So the San Francisco office doesn't have, I don't know if it's like this anymore, but the San Francisco office of Google doesn't have dinner. But there is an engineering team there in the San Francisco office, but they get dinner every day. And so they get like all this nice food brought to them. And then when they're done with their food, they actually put it outside their like kind of walled off space. And they send an email to the listserv saying, here, there's some leftover food, come and get it. And then like my friend and his team, they're just like kind of running upstairs to like get the food. And that just really sucks, right? And that's an example of engineers like kind of being the priestly class in the company. And I think there's a lot of sense of entitlement and negative things that can come from that. So one thing that I'm really proud of here at Gusto is like, we're not the priestly class. We're of course different, but we should be treated, you know, more or less the same and not get special treatment from the rest of the company. And so that's a service mindset is one of those things that's really important to us.
And what are the areas of improvement? So you talked about what you were most proud of. There's values that apparently, you know, you managed to implement quite well. But what are the, you know, areas of improvement, things you'd like to change, or you know, things that need to change because the company is growing?
Good culture, bad culture is not necessarily like a linear thing. I think there's just different cultures, and just because you're not a good fit for those values or those cultures doesn't mean you're a bad person. So I think that's kind of important to call out. It's like transparency, ownership mentality, kind of always explaining the why. And I think sometimes that can cause things to take a little bit longer to roll out than normal. Than if you had like, say, for example, like a command and control type culture. I guess just being completely transparent to our values, I guess, is like, how do we stay true to those, to that value of transparency, but also just kind of at the same time minimize the slowdown that we might experience, right? How can we continue to stay competitive and stay fast while still kind of making people understand the why and being transparent with everyone?
Talked about it earlier, and you had about transparency, an interesting story about maybe not a mistake, but like a bump in the road into implementing the value of transparency. Can you tell us a little bit more about the staff meeting and how?
Okay, yeah, I was wondering what you were talking about. Yeah, this actually happened really recently, and this is again just I guess being really transparent. We have Eng staff meetings, so basically all of my directs, we have a meeting that happens once weekly. We kind of have an agenda. We talk about kind of Eng-wide more management issues and org and scaling and topics like that. We always, like, kind of in line with our value of transparency, would after those meetings send out a summary of everything we talked about there, so that everyone would kind of be transparent what's going on in those meetings. And that worked for a really long time. But as we grew, now we're more than 100 engineers. I realized that when I would send out these notes, there's so much nuance, and for those of you that are kind of in larger companies might relate to this. There's a lot of nuance that happens in those discussions that's hard to convey in kind of a summary digest that you send out every week, right? And sometimes that can actually cause a little bit more confusion, right? So then I'm getting like a lot of questions on like, what are we actually talking about, and like, do we really mean this? I mean that, and so we kind of like swung the pendulum the other way, where we said, okay, we're gonna like actually now say that we're gonna just send out what the agenda topics of those meetings were, and if you have questions about it, come talk to someone on Eng staff so that we can actually convey face to face all the nuances that happen. We still want to be transparent, but it's hard to do it in like kind of a digest way. And I think we got a lot of good feedback from that, right? I think we maybe swung the pendulum a little bit too far the other way, and people felt like it was kind of against our value of transparency. And so I think we kind of landed somewhere a little bit in the middle, where we're sharing a little bit more about what happens in those meetings. We're sharing the outcomes of those discussions, and then we're also sharing who to talk to, who specifically in our Eng staff to talk to if you have more questions about it. Staying true to our value of transparency, but then also like evolving our culture as we scale, right? And being mindful of what works when we're really small, when everyone like can fit in the same room and talk face to face. Doesn't necessarily work when we're 100+ engineers.
And a great example as well of keeping the transparency value is still there. It hasn't changed, but the way you've kind of implemented it is evolving as the company is growing. So interesting how it's a very good example of this that you were mentioning, and also was mentioned in the previous panel as well. So very, very interesting. I think sometimes like culture is it's a bit of a fuzzy topic and a trendy. Everyone is talking about it. Can you give us some practical use case or ways of how you implement the culture on the day-to-day at Gusto to make decision or hiring, or how do you do that?
Values are kind of like almost like your design principles, like the things that are important to you as a company. And so if I extend that analogy a little bit more, like the culture that you build on top of that is kind of like your team's operating system. So when you're building an operating system, maybe this will resonate with people that are engineers here. When you're building an operating system, you probably start with some sort of design principles, and you actually build the system based on those design principles. And I would say culture is kind of like the operating system of your team. And so, and that dictates like a lot of what you do day to day, right? It dictates when you have change, how you communicate that out, or what kind of meetings you're having, how decisions are being made in your company. If you're hitting your goals, you know, how do you reward that? Or if not, like, how do you learn from those mistakes, right? Those all come from like the operating system that you've built. So I would say like almost like every decision that everything that you do in your company comes as a result of the culture that you've built, right? That's kind of like by definition what culture is. So there isn't like really a specific thing where you use culture to make a big decision. You probably use your values a little bit more to guide those decision making. The culture like kind of helps you how to just kind of your day-to-day operations of your team. Maybe one way that culture can help is actually just through recruiting. I think if you find someone that is a really great alignment with your values and your culture, you want to be able to kind of open that up and show it to that person, right? To say, hey, if you join here, this is kind of what it's like here. This is what the culture is like. And so that's one way that you can use culture to kind of like really, I guess, make a decision or try to convince someone to join your company.
Cool. So the one thing to remember, so the values are design principles, the culture is your operating system, and just like any OS, you need some updates. So that's like the thing to remember.
Exactly.
So maybe to wrap up with one last question, I'd like to dig a little bit into Gusto's diversity and inclusion strengths that you have, and the emphasis that I think you're famous for, and it's also something that we see all around the building. So could you tell us more what are you doing on the day-to-day basis on that matter?
Yeah, so I'll preface it by saying that we by no means have figured it out ourselves either, but I am proud of how far we've come. When I started the company with the two other co-founders, it frankly was not something that I was even aware of. And so for me, it's been like kind of a multi-year like education and learning process. And I do think we've made some significant improvements, although we have a lot more to go here at Gusto. Our first step was just kind of identifying that we have a problem here and that it's something that we wanted to fix. And also just kind of clarifying the reasons. We have 3 reasons why we care about diversity and belonging, and just being very explicit about that with the whole company. And then just kind of the first thing that we did, we got inspired by Pinterest, and they had started this practice of actually just publishing their composition numbers. And there's so many different dimensions of diversity, and they're all really important. But if you really want to make progress, I think it's really helpful to focus on one area. The last thing I think, we're discussing it right now actually, so it's still really early. We're just trying to think about how we scale some of our efforts within engineering to have more diversity. And one of the ideas we've been toying around with, and I'm happy to report back on it later, is instead of like the engineering team or those that care about diversity really doing all the work to improve the composition of the team, have better diversity and belonging within our engineering team. So it's an idea that we're toying with right now, but I think that's kind of where we're at on diversity.
Cool. Thanks a lot for sharing all this. I think a lot of companies hear and everywhere, especially tech companies have a lot to learn from you guys, because even if you're quite humble and that's not where you want to be, but I think you're quite advanced in that area. So I got the signs a few minutes ago that we were kind of out of time. So I think now is going to be time for Q&A. It's all time for me to thank you a lot for this fireside chat and also for hosting us. So thanks a lot. And we'll go for a few minutes of questions now.
Hi. So one of the things for engineering culture is that your lowest level manager is usually the person who reinforces it. And if that person doesn't, then you have 8 people who probably aren't adopting it. So what do you use at your level to essentially identify what managers are doing well, what managers are not doing well, which ones kind of just need some help? And then how do you go about actually going forward with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we have a number of different tools to kind of monitor that. One that we have is just kind of an employee engagement, and we have questions that are like standardized across multiple companies, and that's helpful because it allows us to benchmark on how we're doing on certain questions compared to other like tech companies, for example. But we've also like added a lot of questions that are kind of just more Gusto specific. And probably no other company is asking those questions. We send a light version of those quarterly, I think, and then like a really heavy version annually. And that can help myself and other managers kind of get a read of just how teams are doing. And we can also do like cuts by, if the team is large enough, of course, because it's anonymous, but the team is large enough that we can kind of see cuts by team and kind of see how they're benchmarking compared to other teams. So that's just like one way that we can kind of keep a pulse. I think another one is just really like skip level one-on-ones. I like to do office hours. And I think that's for me like kind of a special way of doing office hours that really encourages people to come to them. And so that's another way for myself and other managers to really kind of stay in touch with how things are actually going on within teams.
So my question is actually kind of connected, and it is it has 2 parts. One is, at some point you guys decided to open an office somewhere else, right? When was that and why was that, if you could share that? And then how did you impose that culture in that remote office? Because it's a totally different story, right? If you're not there all the time.
Yeah, so we have a co-headquarter model. So we're located here in San Francisco and then out in Denver, Colorado. We were just growing really, really quickly. And we knew that we couldn't make all those hires here in San Francisco. And so we started looking outside of San Francisco to grow the team. So that was kind of like the main reason. I think we have a belief that I'm sure many of us here share, that great talent is all over the world, and they don't all flock to San Francisco, and so we want to be in as many of those places as possible. And Denver, when we looked at kind of the type of talent that's out there, one of the things we looked at was just kind of almost like the culture and the values of the city. We looked at a number of different cities. Specifically, it was like Salt Lake City, Denver, and Austin. We actually did interviews in each of those cities, even though we hadn't like truly decided the location, and we kind of got to know the people there. Ultimately, Denver came out ahead, which is why we picked Denver. Nick touched upon this a little bit, a landing team. I think about 15 or so Gusties here in San Francisco that really kind of know and embody our culture and our values, and we sent them out there. We rented 3 apartments, like kind of just adjacent to each other, and they live there, and some actually moved there permanently, and they really kind of helped make the first few hires out there. They knew what to look for. We had our version of the values interview, which we call the watermelon interview, and we were doing build a seat of a team there. And so yeah, that's kind of how we made sure that the values are really aligned between San Francisco and our new Denver office. And then also culture was aligned as well. But again, I think the culture, it's okay for it to be a little bit different. And so also giving space for Denver to really kind of shine in their own special way. And so kind of that mix of making sure that the values are really consistent, but culture can change a little bit.
So I know you said earlier on that you try not to give any of your engineers, say, special perks. They're not the priestly class here. But have you ever run into a case where the engineering team or another team wanted to have its own set of values or its own set of culture that was maybe not contradictory to the overall company culture, but at least different? So has there ever been a case where the company culture didn't quite align exactly with a sub-team's culture?
The San Francisco Denver like culture difference is like one layer geographic where you might have cultural differences, but I think even within teams and sub teams within our engineering team in the same geographic location, there are also like kind of slight nuances of culture there. And so I think we'll also feel it when we have an engineer transfer from one team to another. They'll see, oh, this team works a little bit differently. And I think that's okay as long as it's consistent with the overall engineering values. So yeah, I think that's totally okay. I think when it starts to diverge with kind of our engineering value, so a value is like kind of our like service mindset and don't be the priestly class. And if we see like a nuance on that in culture between like teams within the engineering team, I think that is something that you have to act on it and make sure that it's corrected to be more consistent, and that does sometimes happen. Cool. Well,
yeah, I guess let's wrap up. It is almost 9 o'clock. So let's give a round of applause to Eddie and JB.